In the winter of 1942, the war in the air was decided not only by courage, but by altitude. Across the vast reaches of the Pacific and the cold skies above northern Europe, American pilots found themselves fighting battles that seemed rigged by the atmosphere itself. Their aircraft, P-40s over New Guinea, P-39s in the Solomons, and many of the early American fighters stationed in England, all shared the same flaw. Above 20,000 feet, the engines began to gasp. Power faded. Climb rates slowed, and in that thin, hostile air, the enemy waited. Japanese Zero fighters, impossibly light and agile, fell upon American formations from positions the Americans could not reach in time. Over Europe, the Luftwaffe's Bf-109s and Fw-190s circled above incoming bomber streams like hawks, diving with precision into the lumbering shapes of B-17s and B-24s. The sky had become a vertical battlefield, one where the United States lacked the tools to fight effectively. Pilots felt the disadvantage intimately. A lieutenant in the 8th Fighter Command wrote home in December 1942, "We chase them up the ladder, and somewhere near the top, the engine gives up before we do." His frustration echoed across 2 oceans. The American military possessed bravery in abundance, but the physics of altitude favored its enemies. The situation demanded a new answer, something bold enough to overturn assumptions, and durable enough to survive the war's harshest conditions. It came unexpectedly from a twin-engine aircraft unlike anything else in the world. The Lockheed P-38. Lightning first appeared in Army Air Force's testing programs as a curiosity. Long booms, twin engines, a central nacelle for the pilot. A fighter divided in 3, connected by airfoils and intention. At first glance, it seemed a machine built on contradictions. Heavy, yet fast. Complex, yet promising. But beneath its unusual profile lay a design philosophy shaped by America's industrial might. If altitude was the problem, then engineering, not elegance, would solve it. From the beginning, however, the P-38's promise depended on solving a problem that no amount of clean aerodynamics could conceal. Its Allison V-1710 engines, though rugged and efficient at low and medium altitudes, could not deliver sustained power high in the thinning air without help. Without a way to force more air into the cylinders, even so advanced a design risked becoming just another fighter that ran out of breath above 20,000 feet. This is where the story turns. Not in a cockpit, but in America's factories and laboratories. At General Electric's plants in Lynn, Massachusetts and Schenectady, New York, engineers had been quietly refining a technology most nations considered impractical for wartime use: the exhaust-driven turbo-supercharger. The idea was simple to explain, yet brutally difficult to perfect. Instead of relying solely on mechanical compressors like the multi-stage units fitted to British Merlin engines, these devices used the scalding rush of engine exhaust to spin a turbine at extreme speeds. The turbine, in turn, forced fresh air into the cylinders, restoring power lost at altitude. But building turbines that could survive temperatures above 1,000 degrees required metals few countries could produce in quantity. It demanded industrial discipline and precision machining on a scale Germany and Japan could not match in wartime. The United States, however, possessed exactly that kind of industrial backbone. From the late 1930s into 1941, Lockheed's engineers worked hand in hand with their counterparts at GE, knowing that the Lightning's future rested on those glowing, exhaust-driven wheels. They were not seeking a miracle, only a chance to make the Allison engine breathe where nature tried to suffocate it. The collaboration produced something unprecedented: a twin-engine fighter with a turbo-supercharger mounted aft of each engine, fed by long ducts carrying the heat and fury of exhaust gases into spinning turbines. In tests over the Mojave Desert, the results were startling. As the P-38 climbed past 25,000 feet, the engines did not falter. They roared. Turbochargers, the size of kettles and forged from heat-resistant alloys, maintained pressure where other engines wilted. The Lightning could accelerate in thin air, as if diving toward thicker oxygen below. Pilots described the sensation with awe, a kind of mechanical defiance against the natural order. Yet, altitude alone did not win wars, and the turbocharged P-38, for all its promise, still had to prove itself in combat zones where surprise, fear, and attrition ruled. Would this engineering marvel stand against the Zero's supernatural agility? Could it climb above German fighters and strike first? Could a weapon born of American ingenuity survive the chaos ahead? Those questions would soon be answered in the steaming jungles of New Guinea, the Pacific's empty blue corridors, and the frozen altitudes above Europe. But in 1942, as war darkened skies around the globe, the P-38 Lightning represented something rare, a machine built not from desperation, but from innovation, the belief that engineering, pushed hard enough, could change the terms of battle. The first time Lieutenant Mark Ellsworth pushed a turbocharged P-38 into the high desert sky above Muroc, he felt a sensation he later struggled to describe. The aircraft didn't climb so much as rise, steady, deliberate, unbothered by the thinning air. At 15,000 feet, most fighters of the era began to lose their voice, their engines flattening into a strained whine. But the Lightning kept its tone, a deep, confident rumble that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the fuselage, as if the aircraft itself were drawing breath from the open sky. The secret lay in the strange, kettle-shaped device fitted behind each engine, General Electric's exhaust-driven turbo-supercharger. To a casual observer, it looked like a metal drum bolted inside the wing root. But to the engineers who built it, the unit represented the culmination of thousands of hours of experimentation with heat, pressure, and tolerances that pushed American metallurgy to the edge. Inside the turbine housing, exhaust gases from the Allison engine spun a wheel at blistering speeds, feeding compressed air into a second-stage supercharger. What mattered most was that this process used energy other engines simply wasted. The hotter the exhaust, the more power the system delivered. A counterintuitive logic that turned heat, the traditional enemy of aircraft engines, into an unexpected ally. But this innovation did not come easily. In late 1941, GE engineers confronted materials that warped under prolonged stress and housings that cracked at the seams. Test stands glowed orange at night as turbines overheated, bolts sheared, bearings failed. The desert around Muroc became a graveyard of discarded metal. "We broke everything twice," one engineer recalled years later, "and the third time, we just started over." There was discipline in the repetition, and something distinctly American in the refusal to accept defeat's terms. Lockheed's engineering team faced their own challenges. They needed to integrate two turbo systems into a fighter that already defied conventional design. Twin booms housed the engines, the cockpit sat in a central nacelle, and the entire structure depended on maintaining aerodynamic balance. Routing hot exhaust gases through pipes long enough to reach the turbines required imagination and compromise. The solution looked ungainly on the workbench, but in the sky it produced a steady surge of power that no Axis fighter could match at altitude. Throughout 1942, test pilots pushed the P-38 harder. They climbed into thin air above the Sierra Nevada and plunged into dives that forced the airframe to shudder. They traced vast loops across the desert floor, while engineers watched with binoculars, taking notes with the measured calm of surgeons. During one memorable test run, Ellsworth leveled off at more than 30,000 feet. The horizon stretched into a hard, crystalline band. The desert was silent, far below. His breath fogged lightly inside the cockpit. Then he moved the throttle forward. Instead of faltering, the Lightning surged, a living contradiction in the thin blue space above the world. This was the moment that convinced Lockheed's senior engineers that the Lightning was no longer just a fast interceptor or long-range escort. It was a proof of concept that American industry could brute force its way into altitudes the Axis could not reliably reach. Where the British perfected multi-stage mechanical superchargers and the Germans eked out gains from liquid-cooled Daimler-Benz engines, only the United States possessed the industrial capacity and metallurgical expertise to mass-produce exhaust-driven turbo-superchargers for frontline fighters. It was a gamble, but a distinctly American one. There was a quiet arrogance in the choice, an industrial confidence born from the belief that if a problem could be solved through volume, heat-resistant alloys, and machining tolerances measured in 10,000ths of an inch, then the United States was the nation that could do it. By early 1943, the P-38's capabilities were no longer theoretical. Combat squadrons ferrying the aircraft to Alaska, the Pacific, and later to North Africa began filing their first reports. Pilots marveled at how the Lightning held its power during climbs that left other fighters trailing behind. Mechanics noted that the turbo units required attention, but seldom failed outright, a testament to GE's final refinements. And commanders quickly realized that missions once considered impossible, long reconnaissance flights, high-altitude interceptions, deep escort sorties, suddenly had a tool capable of carrying them out. Still, doubts lingered. The P-38 was complex. It demanded careful management of manifold pressures, turbo settings, and engine temperatures. Young pilots transitioning from single-engine aircraft sometimes found themselves overwhelmed by its systems. Instructors joked that a Lightning pilot needed one hand for the yoke and the other for the checklists. But for those who mastered it, the Lightning offered something unprecedented: control over the vertical dimension of combat. By the spring of 1943, the stage was set for the P-38's first great proving grounds. In the jungles of New Guinea, where Japanese fighters retained the tactical advantage of numbers and experience, American squadrons prepared to test whether engineering alone could shift the momentum of the war. They would soon discover that altitude, once an impossible frontier, had become their greatest weapon. By mid-1943, the war in the Southwest Pacific had settled into a brutal rhythm. Every morning, Allied patrols lifted through the haze rising off the New Guinea jungle. Every afternoon, Japanese fighters swept down from hidden airstrips north of the Owen Stanley Range, slipping between towering clouds to strike supply lines, convoys, and isolated outposts. It was a war of terrain as much as machines, thick canopies that concealed movement, sudden storms that scattered formations, and mountains so tall they seemed to scrape the sky. Into this landscape came the P-38 Lightning. The men of the 39th Fighter Squadron were among the first to fly combat missions in the aircraft. Their initial sorties revealed a truth that spread through the group faster than any tactic. At altitude, true altitude, the kind where the sky shifts from blue to indigo, the Lightning behaved like a predator. Problems that plagued Allison-powered fighters at high elevation simply vanished. The turbo-superchargers kept the engines fed. The twin booms cut the air with uncanny stability, and the aircraft could dive upon Japanese formations with a ferocity no other American fighter could match. One pilot, a composite figure drawn from multiple accounts, remembered the moment the doctrine changed. His squadron had climbed to intercept enemy bombers reported heading south from Japanese bases around Wewak, where the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force had massed aircraft in strength. Thin clouds streaked across the sky, flashing momentary shadows across the polished wings. Below him, the jungle appeared like a dark, endless sea. Then his wingman's voice crackled over the radio. "Bandits! 11 o'clock, high." He looked up and felt his breath catch. 3 zeros, trailing faint white ribbons, were circling at nearly 30,000 feet. In the early months of the war, engagements had almost always begun with the Japanese above and the Americans below. Today that imbalance finally tilted. He pushed the throttles forward. The turbos answered instantly. The Lightning surged upward, climbing into the sun. The Zeros, sensing an intruder above them, tightened their formation. But they were seconds too late. The P-38 rolled over the top, the nose dropping with a smooth inevitability that felt almost mechanical. As he descended, the air thickened. Speed built. The aircraft trembled slightly, then steadied as he lined up his shot. 2 short bursts, a flare of debris, a Zero spiraled down, a thin ribbon of smoke marking its fall. The dive continued, violent and exhilarating. The G-forces compressed his vision into a narrow tunnel of light. He pulled out only when the altimeter's needle risked leaving the dial. When he leveled off, he saw the remaining Zeros breaking away, not toward him, but away from the fight entirely. They had learned the same lesson many Japanese pilots would write in their diaries: never follow a Lightning into a dive. This encounter, repeated in different forms across weeks of combat, began shaping a new Pacific doctrine. Own the altitude. Control the fight. Decide the moment of attack. American pilots embraced this shift with a sense of liberation. They no longer needed to force turning fights that favored the lighter, more agile Zero. Instead, they chose engagements like hunters, strikes from above, delivered with precision. The P-38's long legs made it perfect for island-hopping missions, where a lone fighter might fly for hours over empty ocean before meeting an enemy. If an engine failed, the pilot could still limp home, something single-engine fighters could seldom attempt. By late 1943, the Lightning was doing more than surviving. It was leading the fight. The aircraft's growing reputation reached Japan. Pilots who once considered the Zero an untouchable king of the sky now spoke of the twin-engine American fighter with reluctant respect. The two-tailed devil, they called it, a mixture of superstition and observation. Its silhouette, wide, predatory, became an omen over the jungles and sea lanes of the Pacific. Then came a moment that cemented the P-38's legend. In April 1943, American codebreakers intercepted Japanese communications, revealing that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, would be flying from Rabaul to Bougainville. The route, altitude, and escort details were precise. It was an opportunity no commander could ignore, but only one aircraft had the range and altitude performance necessary to strike. The mission fell to P-38's of the 339th Fighter Squadron. Taking off before dawn, they flew low to avoid radar, hugging the sea until the coastline blurred with morning mist. When they finally climbed, the turbo-superchargers roared as if announcing their purpose. They rose above the clouds, leveling off near the predicted altitude. There, a formation of Japanese bombers emerged, glittering in the morning sun. The intercept unfolded swiftly. A Lightning lined up behind the leading bomber, firing short, decisive bursts. Yamamoto's aircraft, hit and burning, rolled into the jungle below. To historians, it became one of the most precisely executed aerial ambushes ever flown. To the pilots, it proved a simpler truth. Without the Lightning's speed, its turbos, and its unmatched range, the mission could never have been attempted. By the end of 1943, the Lightning had become more than a fighter. It was a strategic tool, a long-range escort, a high-altitude interceptor, a reconnaissance platform, and an assassin. And as American forces pushed closer to the Philippines and the Marianas, the P-38 would face its greatest test, not from the enemy, but from the brutal demands of distance, weather, exhaustion, and the unforgiving geometry of the Pacific War. By early 1945, the Pacific War had stretched into distances almost unimaginable to those watching from home. Squadrons that had once fought over the jungles of New Guinea now ranged out across the Philippines, the South China Sea, and the long arc toward Formosa. The P-38 Lightning had traveled this whole distance with them, from a curious, unconventional prototype to a trusted companion in the cruel arithmetic of aerial combat. Yet, as the final campaigns approached, the Lightning's story entered its most human chapter. The reckoning between what machines could endure and what men could bear. On a humid morning in Luzon, a pilot from a reconnaissance detachment, another composite character drawn from many memoirs, prepared for a mission that blended monotony with peril. His aircraft was stripped of guns, fitted instead with cameras mounted in the nose. These unarmed P-38's flew deeper and higher than almost anything else in the theater. They went alone, counting on altitude, speed, and the vastness of the sky to shield them. He climbed steadily, the air thinning until the clouds below took on the texture of pressed wool. At 25,000 feet, the turbo-superchargers delivered their familiar promise: steady thrust, crisp engine response, the hum of machinery designed for the edge of flight. He leveled off, adjusted his oxygen, and let the Lightning settle into its stride. The cameras clicked rhythmically, capturing roads, airfields, and coastal batteries far below. Then the quiet shifted. A single Zero appeared, climbing hard, a pale shape rising through scattered clouds. The pilot glanced at his fuel gauge, then at the horizon. He had no guns. His only weapon lay beneath the cowling, the power that the turbos could still deliver above 30,000 feet. He pushed the throttles forward. The Lightning answered exactly as engineers at Lockheed and GE had intended, surging toward the upper reaches of the mission profile. The Zero strained behind him, growing smaller, but not vanishing. For minutes that felt like hours, the chase drew a long, fragile line across the sky. Each aircraft fought its own battle with physics. The Zero, with its weight and aerodynamic purity. The Lightning with its twin turbines consuming exhaust like breath. Eventually, the Japanese fighter faltered. The air was simply too thin. The P-38 climbed again, angling gently away, disappearing into the high blue light where the Zero could not follow. The pilot exhaled. His cameras kept clicking. It was a small encounter, one of hundreds lost to the larger sweep of war, but it represented the core of the Lightning's achievement. At altitude, the aircraft turned vulnerability into survival. Elsewhere, the P-38's contributions took on heavier tones. The long-range missions of 1944 and 1945 pushed pilots to emotional and physical limits. Time aloft was measured not just in hours, but in static-filled radio calls and the slow tightening of chest straps. Sunlight poured through unfiltered canopies, bleaching uniforms and burning skin. Oxygen masks left red marks along cheekbones. The loneliness of the high sky carved itself into memory. Yet the men trusted the Lightning. Trust in war is its own kind of armor. When the P-51 Mustang finally entered widespread service in 1944, many pilots transferred to the sleeker, faster newcomer. But reconnaissance units kept their P-38's. Long-range escort groups kept them for certain missions. And Pacific commanders, who understood the map's vastness better than anyone, kept the Lightning in frontline duties until the last months of the war. In Europe, the aircraft's legacy evolved in parallel. P-38's escorted bombers deep into German airspace, photographed the Rhine crossings, and hunted rail yards from high altitude. Though not universally loved by pilots, some complained about cockpit heating, others about compressibility issues in dives. The aircraft endured because it solved problems no other Allied fighter could handle simultaneously. By the summer of 1945, the world that had demanded such extremes was coming undone. Japan's air defenses thinned. The Zero, once the terror of the Pacific, became a rarity. American pilots flew their final missions against an enemy exhausted and outmatched. And when the war finally ended in August, the Lightning's twin engines fell silent over fields from Okinawa to Ieshima. Months later, many P-38's sat abandoned along Pacific airstrips, their aluminum skins dulled by tropical rains. Some were scrapped, others were left to rot where they had landed last. A few were pushed into the jungle and forgotten, relics of a war that had moved on faster than the machines that fought it. But for the pilots who had flown them, men who now stepped back into civilian lives, the Lightning remained vivid in recollection. At reunions decades later, veterans would lean on canes, pointing at surviving aircraft in museums. Their voices softened when they described how the P-38 felt in a climb, how the turbos responded, how the twin booms framed the world in moments of fear and triumph. Memory restored the details time had stolen, the hum of oxygen flow, the smell of engine oil, the way sunlight flashed off bare metal at 30,000 feet. They spoke of the aircraft with a mixture of pragmatism and affection, an understanding that the P-38 had not been perfect, but had been exactly what the war required. It bridged distances that seemed impossible, fought in altitudes no American fighter had mastered before, and carried men home when home felt very far away. The final truth echoed not from textbooks, but from the quiet reflections of those who survived. The P-38 Lightning proved that innovation born of necessity can change the fate of battlefields. Its turbo-superchargers, forged in heat, tested in the thin air, turned a flawed engine into a weapon of reach and resilience. And as one veteran whispered at an air show long after the war, looking up as a restored P-38 climbed into the afternoon sky, you never forget the sound of those turbos, or the feeling that they were lifting more than just the airplane.